So as we continue to move through the content, if you remember, we just went through some information about NetFlow as well as the appliances that we're going to leverage in our solution, as well as in the lab solution. We're going to deploy a very common deployment scenario and some of the capabilities of the product. Certainly there's a lot more information out there. But as we begin to continue into our deployment training here, installation training, we want to make sure that you are continuing to work with the customer and make sure that you are now at this point, you've reviewed the bill of materials and you want to start to gather based on your particular deployment for that customer, gathering what is necessary for the installation and the front end of the installation. So one of the things you're going to do is you're going to make sure you understand how and where to gather the Stealthwatch code upgrades and patches. Because this is a appliance-based deployment, for the physical appliances, they're going to be shipped from distribution to your customer. The physical appliances are very often running an older revision of code. You cannot downgrade these appliances because upgrades to the appliances not only upgrade the operating system, the software and code itself, but also the schema of the databases. And because of that, it's a move forward proposition for an existing customer deployment. So what they end up doing is they end up shipping to distribution appliances on a slightly older revision of code, so that if you happen to have a customer that wants to add a flow collector but is not on the latest code revision, you have the ability to purchase that without having to force an upgrade. Now what that means though is that if you are deploying a new installation of Stealthwatch, you will almost always have to do upgrades at the beginning of the project. Now most people think that upgrades are, in many cases, are done later on, but again, you've seen this in other appliances, maybe firewalls. We need to get it on the appropriate code revision, so it's going to be important you know where to get these code upgrades and various patches that may be required. Now, for the virtual appliances, if you have any of those that you're deploying, these are OVF files. We can show you where to download those as well. You have the option to download the latest versions or archived versions in many cases of those. So typically, you're not performing an upgrade, you're just deploying the correct version initially. You also want to get your hands on the appropriate documentation for that version. The patch and version upgrade docs, release notes are available on the licensing and download site. However, the appliance documentation specific to the appliances and usability and administrative guide, those are actually all available natively on the appliances themselves. So once you get an appliance running, you can actually download the how to use documents, if you will. You may want to also prepare a document packet for the customer. Many times we'll have our customers actually deploy or rack and stack the physical hardware, cable the appliances, deploy the OVFs. Some need more help than others. You're going to have to gauge that with your customer. However, providing them with a document packet so that they deploy it correctly, cable the right interfaces correctly, et cetera, is going to be critical. Otherwise, again, you'll get on site and find out you don't have reachability and that change controls may be required to fix the issues that they've created. So I keep mentioning change controls, and I can't mention enough, so I even put a slide in here. There are a lot of things that have to happen. We've had large customers, as an example, that when we're looking at deploying especially hardware in their data center for these appliances, you may be talking about a change control and procedures related to simply racking the hardware. You may require another one for powering the hardware appropriately. You may require another change control for another team that does the Ethernet cabling as a subsequent change control, as well as the IP addressing. Because of all of the steps in the process, and depending on how your customer is architected and how many levels of change control and complexity they have may have in place, again, it's going to be critical that you understand what that looks like, so that you can make sure that you don't run into a situation where you have delays that you were not expecting to occur. So we want to make sure that we're getting them the information they need. They know exactly what to cable, how to rack it, how it's powered, where it goes, what talks to what, so that we can get all of that out of the way before you go on site. Because once you get on site, ideally, the system has an IP address on it, it's reachable, and now you can begin to integrate each appliance with each other, as well as start processing NetFlow and begin the actual deployment and customization for that customer. It is not unusual as well, especially in smaller customers, for you to maybe even do the rack and stack. That's fine, but again, make sure you understand what it's going to take and that they're prepared for that rack and stack and cabling process. Now, at the bottom here, I mentioned a couple things that could help you with this change control, notion of change control with a customer. One, remember, Stealthwatch, if we can ideally make it non-production, considered to be non-production, even though it's touching the production network, try to do that. It'll often help you get out of change controls or allow you to skirt some of the change control policies. Again, the appliances we're talking about putting in place are just servers on the network that are going to take in data and process data. They are not in the packet processing path. They are not going to cause an outage. They are going to be IP'd and reachable. It is not in line. And if you can drive this with some of your customers, you may be able to get around some flexible change control rules, at least at the beginning of the deployment, that could speed your deployment timeline. Certainly once this starts to process live traffic, and definitely after it's being leveraged by analysts, it becomes considered a production deployment. And at that point, additional changes may be a little bit more complicated. So let's talk about the physical appliances. So we want to make sure we understand what physical appliances are part of the deployment for your customer and understand who is going to rack and stack the equipment. Is that going to be you physically installing the equipment? Are you going to do the initial KVM configuration? The hardware appliances do have, and we'll show you a picture of them here shortly, the hardware appliances look like any other server, but again, these are physical appliances. They're servers. They will need to be configured initially. Even to get the IP address on them, you're going to have to initially connect to them. We'll talk through that process, but quite often it's KVM. Just get a keyboard and a monitor attached and you're good to go. Again, for some of the other appliances, make sure you understand the cabling requirements. So as an example, with the flow sensor, you may need a span port or a tap in order to get to the appropriate segments, and that may mean configuring span ports on Cisco or other platform routing and packet passing devices. It may mean getting a tap set up or connecting to the customer's Gigamon solution as an example. But make sure you understand all of the physical connectivity that's going to be required so the customer can get that set up before you're too deep in the deployment. Now, as far as getting the IP address set on these devices and the physical devices on the network, once you've cabled them, you certainly can get in. You can, in many data centers, they'll often have a cart they can roll around. I've heard it called a lot of things, whether it's a crash cart or just a KVM. But they'll have a cart they can roll around with a keyboard or a series of keyboards of different types, USB and otherwise, as well as monitors. Roll it over, connect it to the appliance, boot it up, and at that point you'll get a command shell that then you can use to put the IP address on the box, and we'll show you that in a second. Additionally, though, if for some reason you don't have KVM available to you, you can actually connect directly to the management interface with an Ethernet cable. There are default IP addresses for each of the 4 platforms, the SMC, Flow Collector, Flow Sensor, and UDP Director. So you can actually directly connect to them and do some base configuration. Now, the virtual appliance implementation certainly doesn't require rack and stack or direct cabling. So typically this is a conversation with the virtualization team at the customer. So depending on the platform, we need to make sure they understand the requirements. Now, one of the things that I'm going to say here is that when you have this conversation with the virtualization team, all of the virtualization teams out there working in VMware know how to deploy OVFs and know how to deploy appliances. There are some specific requirements and specific configurations with these appliances, though, that need to be followed. So we do not allow for sharing for the solution to be, or resource sharing for the solution to be supported. So as an example, and I'll show you this on an upcoming slide, we have very specific per virtual model number of processors that must be dedicated, RAM, right? Your memory must be dedicated, and disk that must be pre-allocated to the solution. Now, these are conversations you want to have very early on, because some of these appliances, these large virtual appliances, have very, very high resource requirements that will be a little surprising to a VM team individual when they're used to thin provisioning appliances, if you will. So we need to get our hands on the appliance files. So they all are OVF deployed on ESX or ESXi in our lab. So we're going to we'll deploy virtual machines in the dCloud lab environment. So that's what you'll be working on. But we're going to have to obtain the specific files of the specific version for each appliance, provide them to the customer, and make sure they deploy them with the appropriate configuration changes, the dedicated resources, as well as network configuration, right? We want to make sure that the VM nets are set up correctly, whether it's the flow sensor or the physical appliances, we need IP reachability. Now, one thing that's going to be a little bit unique, since this is a relatively recent acquisition, is that these licenses and software and all of that type of end of the management of the product is not yet performed on Cisco.com. When you get this information, the data that will be transmitted to you about this process from the customer support team will instruct you where to go, but specifically, just so you know, it's going to be to a different site, not Cisco.com. It'll be to landcope.flexnetoperations.com. This is probably a site that you're not that familiar with. So, but briefly, just know that there is a different site you go to. It is not Cisco.com. As you can see here on the right-hand side, however, we have the ability to look at the products, get to the downloads, get to the licensing information, etc. And we're going to take you through some of this as we talk a little bit about getting the software, and then later on as we talk about licensing, because that will also be performed in the FlexNet operations location. So for getting the OVF files for the virtual deployments, you will want to go to the downloads link under products. Go to the downloads link, and you can see that slide here. It's in the middle of the page. You'll have multiple versions available. The current and archive version tabs are available for that customer depending on what they've purchased. You'll be able to then, depending on what they've purchased, go in, see the software, drive into the software that you specifically want. In this case, at the bottom of the page on the right-hand side, we're looking at the flow collector for NetFlow Virtual Edition install OVF file. And you can see here it's a 1.8 gig zip file. Please be aware that that is a zip file that you're downloading. You're not going to install a zip file on a VMware server, so someone is going to have to unzip that to get to the actual OVF to do the install. Now, once they've been racked, the appliances have been racked, or if the virtual machine has been deployed, we can then get the IP address on it, right? So again, get the KVM connected. For the virtual machines, use VMware console, but what you're going to do is via KVM or the VMware console, you're going to get to the console interface on the physical or virtual appliance, and you're going to get into the systems configuration menu option, and this is what that looks like here. Upon connecting to the system, it will ask you for login. There is a default username. We'll actually cover the multiple default usernames and passwords at the end of the session today as well. But just at this point, when you log in for the first time to an appliance, you're going to log in as sysadmin, and the password is LAN1COPE. That will prompt you, or that'll automatically launch the menu here, the system configuration menu. The top option, the management option, is where the customer would go, or you if you're helping them, go in to configure the IP addresses. And you can see on the right-hand side, it's basically just asking what IP address are we putting on this appliance, what's the mask, what's the broadcast range, and what is the gateway. If it's correct, just hit yes, and that IP will be deployed.